The Florida Writer Podcast, a discussion about writing and other things.
Hello, and welcome back to this edition of the Florida Writer Podcast. I am Allison Nissen, your host, and today we are lucky enough to have with us John Davis Jr. John, welcome to the Florida Writer Podcast, and give me a 60-second elevator pitch about who you are and what you write.
Thank you. I am John Davis Jr. I am a Florida poet, and my books include Class American Proverb, which was published in 2014 by Negative Capability Press, Hard Inheritance, which is my latest collection. It was published in 2016 by Five Oaks Press, and then I have two smaller volumes, chapbooks, that are also available. Right now, my project is really focusing on the Dozier Reform School for boys. A lot of my poems have centered upon that issue. Ever since the discovery was made in 2014, that has really spoken to me, and so a lot of my poetry has been centered on that topic lately.
The Reform School, and tell me the name of that again.
That is the Arthur Dozier Reformatory School. It's in Marianna, Florida. It's up in the Panhandle. In 2014, they discovered the bodies of 55 boys in anonymous graves on the school grounds. And as an educator and as a dad of two boys, that really spoke to me, and it started driving an awful lot of poems that I was writing, whether consciously or unconsciously. And so I decided to begin assembling those, and it's coming together nicely.
I imagine that really takes you into a deep emotional state when you start to consider all the facts and the articles that have come out. I do recall reading a lot about that situation when it was discovered. And I know as a mother, I have also felt sadness for the entire situation. And then as well, the ones that were left behind, but the ones that lived through, they must have lived through something relatively horrific.
Yes, and it is my understanding that they have records of 41 boys who died under the care of the Dozier School, whose bodies they have not found, which is kind of equally gruesome if you think about it. I mean, yes, it is horrific that they discovered the bodies of these 55 boys there on the school ground, but what a loss to have 41 students who have just essentially disappeared.
And so this was a reformatory school. Is that equivalent to juvenile detention center?
Somewhat. From the time that it opened, it was intended to be a combination of discipline and education, although there was more of the former than the latter. What happened at that school was horrific in every way that you can imagine. The accounts that survivors give are just frankly atrocious. The things that occurred within the walls of that school are things that no one should ever have to confront or encounter, and yet they did. And because my first teaching job was at a juvenile boot camp, I'm very familiar with what a correctional educational environment should look like and how beneficial those can actually be for some people. I have a former student who is now an underwater welder in the Northeast, and he's doing quite well for himself, as you might imagine. But the Dozier School, it really penetrated my emotions to a point where I felt like I had to write about it. And so a lot of my poems recently, frankly, over the last 5 years, have come back to that subject.
I can only imagine the outlet that poetry provides you if you're in a deep state of emotion, that you can actually put it on paper and create something beautiful from something that is tragic. That is, to me, one of the benefits of writing poetry to begin with.
Yeah, I was very fortunate in that some of my Dozier poems were picked up by well-regarded journals like the Fantastic Floridas, put out by Borough Press, and then Tampa Review. Both of those publications carried poems, as did Cigar City Poetry Journal. which is a bilingual journal. They have connections in South America as well as here in Florida. They're based out of Ybor City. And through those journals, I have been able to get these poems that have been very deeply touching me personally out there in front of an audience who perhaps can at least sympathize, if not empathize.
How would you define poetry?
Well, I define poetry as any written words that take on a shape or a form that allows you to know you are reading something that is beautifully uncommon. And that seems to be kind of a vague definition. I mean, I could probably sit here and quote what other poets have said poetry is over the years, but it's kind of like when you go to a museum and you know that you are standing before a masterpiece. You don't have to be told that's a masterpiece. When you're reading a poem, when you are reading poetry, you don't have to be told this is poetry, because it is an innate quality or feature of that particular genre, that particular piece.
I love the phrase beautifully uncommon. I had always defined poetry as trying to say the most with the least amount of words, trying to paint the picture with as few words as possible, trying to relay an emotion with as few words as possible. Although that's not always true. Some poets do like to continue going on and on and on about a subject. However, that's always been, for me, my own definition. But I really, really like the expression beautifully uncommon. I'm going to adopt that as my own. So thank you for sharing that little bit of information. You prefer poetry over prose. Do you also like to write prose?
I do write prose occasionally. I have written some nonfiction journal articles. I have written a couple of pieces of fiction that have found homes in places like the Dead Mule School of Southern Literature, because even when I write prose, it tends to take on a regional bent. And I've been fortunate in that my prose, whenever I have chosen to write it, has kind of found a home. But I don't do it often. Prose is, for me, kind of a vacation from the norm of poetry. And because of that, I guess the best way to put it is, it's more of an avocation than a vocation.
I understand that you had a time as the Orchard Keeper Writer's Resident. What exactly does it mean to have a writer's residency, and what are the Orchard Keeper Writers?
The Orchard Keeper Writer's Residency is in Speedwell, Tennessee, which is a little tiny town in the middle of Appalachia. And it afforded me some time to have solitude and really focus exclusively on my writing. The manager, operator, I guess we could say, of the residency is Denton Loving, who is the former editor of Draft Horse Literary Journal. And he had seen, in fact, he had published some of my work a few years ago, I suppose now. And when he first announced that he was going to be providing this opportunity, I got in touch with him because I have always loved the mountains. I have always loved that region of the country. And while I was there, I was able to stay in a small cabin kind of nestled in the foothills of Tennessee, right where Tennessee meets Kentucky and even Virginia there. And it really was a very meaningful time because I was able to focus so entirely upon my craft. And it was only about a week, but it was very worthwhile.
Now, when you are in a residency, are you required to also give back to the community, or was it that you were provided a cabin and able to write in solitude?
In this case, for this residency, the entire intent was to provide a space for a writer like myself to focus only on his or her work. And that's what I did. Now, there are some residencies where they do have a community involvement component where you're prescribed a certain number of readings or a certain number of events that you're going to be doing. But in the case of the Orchard Keeper Writer's Residency, it is strictly for the artistic indulgement, I guess you could say, or indulgence of the writer who was there.
That sounds like an amazing opportunity. I imagine several people would love to have something along those lines, that they can just go off and spend a whole week doing nothing but thinking about the craft of writing.
Yeah, it was very helpful because I had a collection of work that I was putting together at that time. And so being as remote as I was allowed me really to focus on the structure and on the order of the work that I was compiling.
How does your creative process differ from when you were up in the woods versus when you're normally at home?
When I am at home, I will typically get up very early. I'm one of those writers that you've heard about that gets up in the wee hours and gets some work done before the activity of the day actually begins. And there's kind of a fine literary tradition of people who have done that. And certainly there are some people who are night owls who would never be able to do that. But I get up usually somewhere between 4:30 and 5, and I spend some time working on writing. My wife does not always enjoy that because, of course, when I get up, then she is shaken as well. But all of that to say, my routine, my kind of everyday writing routine, involves a certain degree of being a morning person. And so that's how that transpires.
I imagine that getting up early in the morning, it's before the house is alive and you have the solitude that would be similar to when you were in the woods.
Yes. One thing that I have found to be true is that there is a fine balance between just enough silence and too much silence. I'm not a person who can write, for example, in a public library, because usually the public library is so very sterile and so very quiet, and there's only the shush of pages and maybe a little murmur of whispers in the background, but there's something almost kind of artificial about that kind of silence that inhibits creative flow, at least for me. Whenever I'm in an environment like my home where there is still, for instance, the air conditioner kicking on or something of that nature, or in the cabin in the woods, of course, because it was as cool as it was, I was able to write with all the windows open. And so you have bird song coming in and you have the noise of neighboring cows and nature. That's just enough. You know, it is kind of a perfect situation for writing where you have a little bit of background noise, but not that vacuum where there's just absolute, almost deafening silence, to borrow a phrase.
Would you say that your education in writing has helped you with the craft of writing?
The MFA program that I went through at the University of Tampa has really been invaluable to my development as a poet, because I was able to study under masters like Peter Meinke, our state's poet laureate, and Erica Dawson, who has won many, many awards and recently was lauded for her book, When Rap Spoke Straight to God. That was from Tin House. By learning from people who have really developed a style of their own and a sensibility about poetry, that allowed me to begin to do the same. And even now, I feel like when I write a piece, I often hold it up. The litmus test for me is, how would a workshop in an MFA program or in a workshop elsewhere, how would this be received there? How would this be received by certain people whose viewpoints on poetry I greatly admire? And that has been one of the things that has been very helpful. The ability to look at a piece with someone's eyes besides your own.
I understand that with the idea of education allows you to model yourself after experts that you have been able to meet, shake their hands, study with them, and allow them to mentor you to the next level of writing. That does sound like something that is very appealing to many, many people.
Yes, I've also been to a number of different conferences since the MFA program. And one that I went to, I was fortunate to study under poet Amy Newman at the Glen West Writers Workshop in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And that was another experience where, like you were saying, you're able to get some viewpoints that allow you to refine your work in a different way.
Refining our work, always the challenge.
Absolutely.
All right, John, I am going to switch gears and we are going to move to our rapid fire questions. Are you ready?
I am ready.
Do you prefer writing with paper or on a keyboard?
Paper.
Paper, you're old school.
I am. I draft on paper and I finalize on the screen.
That makes a lot of sense. A lot of people do the same thing. When was the last time you stayed up past 4 a.m?
Wow. Years ago, I would say when I was an undergraduate at Florida Southern College and I had wild and crazy friends and we would go out to Denny's at 3 a.m. for fudge brownie treats.
I could see staying up till 3 a.m. for a fudge brownie treat. That might be worthwhile. And our final question, the big challenge, is tomato a fruit or a vegetable?
A tomato belongs in a salad, but it is a fruit.
Yes, but peaches and mangoes are also really good in salads.
That is true. That is true. I will concede that.
If you add an avocado, I'm just there. I think that sounds like a delicious lunch.
Oh, yeah.
Well, John, thank you so much for stopping by. How can people get in touch with you?
They can visit my website, which is poetjohndavisjr.com, and they can drop me a message there. I'm also on LinkedIn, and I'm also on Facebook. I'm relatively easy to find. I am no longer a Twitter user, however.
We have to pick and choose our social media sites because they can become overwhelming. At least that's my 2 cents.
Absolutely.
Well, John, again, thank you for stopping by. This has been the Florida Writer Podcast. Allison out.
John Davis Jr. is the author of Hard Inheritance, Middle Class, and 2 other books of poetry. He has been nominated multiple times for the Pushcart Prize, and he holds an MFA from the University of Tampa. His writings are published in literary journals throughout the South and around the world. He teaches English literature for Keiser University. Visit him on the web at poetjohndavisjr.com. Thank you for listening to this edition of the Florida Writer Podcast. For more information about the Florida Writers Association, visit us on the web, floridawriters.net.